I was 95 years old when I watched my granddaughter open a box that should have stayed buried forever. The moment her fingers touched that yellowed envelope, I felt my heart stop, because I knew what was inside. I knew the handwriting before she even pulled it out. My father's confession, a secret so dark it had shaped every single day of my life for over 50 years. And now, standing in my dusty attic, I realized there was no way to stop the truth from finally coming out. My hands were shaking. Not from age, not from the cold October wind rattling the windows, but from pure terror. Because some secrets aren't meant to protect us, they imprison us. And this one had been my prison cell since I was 11 years old. The attic smelled like old wood and forgotten memories. Dust particles floated in the pale afternoon light, coming through the small round window. My granddaughter Emily knelt on the floor, surrounded by Halloween decorations she'd come to find. Orange plastic pumpkins, fake cobwebs, paper skeletons. None of it mattered now, because in her 16-year-old hands, she held something far more terrifying than any costume could ever be. A locked wooden box. Dark mahogany. The same box I had sealed myself in the summer of 1972, right after my father's funeral. I had hidden it behind old furniture, beneath winter blankets, under boxes of Christmas ornaments. I had buried it so deep I almost convinced myself it didn't exist anymore. But Emily had found it. Of course she had. That girl had always been too curious for her own good. Too brave. Too willing to dig where others would leave things alone. She got that from me, I suppose. Before that terrible night, in May 1972, stole my courage, and turned me into a woman who spent her whole life running from the truth. No. The word barely came out as a whisper. Emily, no, put that back. Put it back right now. But she had already broken the old rusty lock. Her young fingers, so much steadier than mine, had pried it open with a screwdriver she'd found in one of my toolboxes. The lid creaked as it opened, revealing the envelope inside. My initials were written across it in my father's unmistakable handwriting, C.W., for your eyes only. When you're ready. 53 years. That envelope had been waiting 53 years for someone to open it. And I had never been ready. I would never have been ready. Grandma, Emily said softly, pulling the envelope out with careful hands. What is this? Why was this box hidden behind everything else? Why does it have a lock? Her green eyes looked up at me, full of questions I couldn't answer. Questions I'd been avoiding my entire adult life. I tried to walk toward her, tried to take that envelope from her hands before she could open it, but my legs wouldn't move. It was like being frozen in a nightmare, watching something terrible happen and being completely powerless to stop it. Don't read it, I finally managed to say, my voice cracking. Please, sweetheart, don't read that letter. Just put it back in the box and let's forget you ever found it. Let's go downstairs and finish baking that apple pie. Let's pretend this never happened. Even as the words left my mouth, I knew they were useless. You can't unsee what's already been seen. You can't unknown what's already been discovered. Emily was already opening the envelope, her fingers sliding along the seal that had stayed closed for over half a century. The paper was yellowed and brittle with age. 3 pages, covered in my father's neat handwriting. The same handwriting I'd seen on birthday cards and grocery lists. The same handwriting that had signed my report cards and written notes for my school lunches. The same handwriting that had documented a secret so terrible it destroyed our family before we even knew we had one. Emily unfolded the pages carefully. She started reading silently, her eyes moving across the lines. I watched her face change, from curiosity to confusion, from confusion to shock, from shock to something that looked like horror. When she finally looked up at me, all the color had drained from her face. Grandma, she whispered. What does he mean by the night of May 1972? What does he mean when he says you were the only witness? Witness to what? And there it was. The question I'd been dreading for 53 years. The question that had haunted my dreams, turned peaceful nights into battles with memories I couldn't escape. I leaned against the doorframe, suddenly feeling every single one of my 95 years weighing on my shoulders like stones. "Read it," I said, my voice barely audible. "If you've already started, read it all. Read every word. Because once you know, once you understand what happened that night, nothing will ever be the same again. Not for you, not for me, not for anyone in our family." Emily looked down at the letter again. Her hands were trembling now. She understood, somehow, that what she was about to read would change everything. She began reading aloud, her young voice giving life to my father's words. Words that had waited in the darkness for 5 decades to finally be heard. "My dearest Catherine, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer here to explain in person what I should have told you years ago." The sound of my father's confession, spoken by my granddaughter's voice in that dusty attic, was almost unbearable. I closed my eyes, and suddenly I wasn't 95 anymore. I was 11 again, standing in our barn on a stormy May night, watching something no child should ever witness. Thunder had been shaking our farmhouse that night. Rain pounded against the windows so hard I thought the glass might break. I was supposed to be asleep in my bed, but my father's voice had woken me, urgent, panicked, different from any way I'd ever heard him speak before. "Catherine, wake up. I need you to come with me." I remember stumbling out of bed, confused and scared. My mother tried to stop him from taking me outside, but he wouldn't listen. He grabbed my hand and pulled me through the rain, across the muddy yard, toward the barn. Lightning lit up the sky, turning everything into sharp shadows and blinding light. When we got to the barn, he pushed the door open. The smell hit me first. Metallic, sharp, wrong. Then I saw him. A man lying on the floor near my father's workbench. Blood everywhere, so much blood. His eyes were closed. His body was completely still. I thought he was dead. For 53 years, I believed I had witnessed a murder that night. Emily's voice brought me back to the present. She was still reading, her words cutting through my memories like a knife through old wounds. "It means you finally found the courage to open this box, to face what we left behind that night. I know you were just a child. I know what you saw traumatized you in ways I could never fully repair. But you need to know the truth, Catherine. The whole truth. Not just the fragments you witnessed." My throat tightened. Tears started forming in my eyes, blurring my vision of Emily kneeling on that attic floor. I had spent 53 years trying to bury that night so deep it could never resurface. But here it was, rising from its grave, demanding to be acknowledged. That night, you saw something no 11-year-old should ever see. You saw violence, you saw blood. You saw what you believed was death. And I, your father, the man who was supposed to protect you from darkness, I made you part of it. I made you keep a secret that was too heavy for your young shoulders to carry. Emily paused, looking up at me with tears in her own eyes now. "Grandma," she said softly. "What happened? Who was that man?" "Keep reading," I told her. "You'll understand soon enough." "But what you didn't know," Emily continued, her voice shaking slightly. "What I never had the courage to tell you, was that the man you saw on the barn floor that night wasn't dead. He was badly hurt, but he was alive. And more than that, Catherine, he wasn't a stranger, he was family. He was my brother. Your Uncle Thomas." The attic seemed to tilt around me. Uncle Thomas, a man whose name I'd never heard spoken aloud in my entire childhood. A man who had been erased from our family history so completely that not even a single photograph remained. "You have an uncle." Emily stared at me with wide eyes. "You never mentioned having an uncle." "I never knew about him," I managed to say. "My father never spoke about him, not once. It was like he never existed." "But he did exist," Emily said, looking back at the letter. "And according to this, he was your father's older brother." She continued reading, and with every word, the story I thought I knew shattered into pieces. Thomas had been 2 years older than my father. They'd grown up together on our farm in Victoria, British Columbia. But when their father died in 1960, the will left everything to my father instead of Thomas. The older son, the one who should have inherited by tradition, got nothing. Thomas believed the farm should have been his. Emily read, as the firstborn son, he felt entitled to it. But your grandfather saw things differently. Thomas had problems. Catherine, serious problems. He gambled. He drank too much. He associated with dangerous people. Your grandfather feared that if he left the farm to Thomas, it would be lost within a year. I leaned harder against the doorframe, my legs feeling weak. My father had inherited the farm, and I'd never questioned why. I'd always assumed he was an only child. It never occurred to me there might have been someone else. Someone who felt betrayed, someone who disappeared. When your grandfather died and the will was read, Emily continued, Thomas was furious. He accused your father of manipulating their father against him. He swore revenge. Then he vanished. He left Victoria, and for 12 years, your father heard nothing from him. He thought maybe Thomas had made peace with it, built a new life somewhere else. Emily's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. He was wrong. A chill ran down my spine despite the warmth of the October afternoon. On May 14, 1972, Thomas came back. It was a stormy night. Your father woke to the sound of breaking glass. Someone was in the barn. He knew immediately it was Thomas. He could feel it. I remembered that night so clearly. The storm, my father's panicked voice, the way he'd pulled me out of bed and dragged me through the rain to the barn. At the time, I hadn't understood. I was just a terrified child following her father into the darkness. Your father went to the barn, Emily read. He should have called the police. He should have stayed in the house. But he didn't. He was angry. Angry that after 12 years of silence, Thomas would come back like a thief in the night. When he got to the barn, Thomas was there, going through boxes, looking for something. The property deed, your father realized. Thomas thought if he could find it and destroy it, maybe he could claim the farm was never legally transferred. They argued, quietly at first, then louder. Thomas accused your father of stealing his birthright. Your father told him their father had made the right choice. Then Thomas lunged at him. Emily stopped reading. Her hands were shaking so badly now, the pages were rustling. Grandma, she said, did they fight? Did your father kill his own brother? I thought he did, I whispered. For 53 years, I thought I witnessed my uncle's death, but keep reading. There's more. We fought, Emily continued, and Thomas fell. He hit his head on the corner of the workbench. The old wooden one with the metal edge. There was so much blood. He collapsed, and for a moment, I was certain I'd killed my own brother. Then I heard you calling from the house. You'd woken up, heard the commotion, and I panicked. I made the worst decision of my life. Instead of calling for help, instead of getting Thomas to a hospital, I ran to get you. I thought if you saw him, if you witnessed what happened, somehow that would make it real. Would force me to deal with it instead of pretending it never occurred. Tears were streaming down my face now. All these years, I'd never understood why my father brought me to that barn. Why would a loving father show his child something so traumatic? Now I knew. He'd been in shock. Not thinking clearly. Desperately needing someone else to anchor him to reality. I brought you to the barn. Emily read through her own tears. I showed you Thomas lying there. I told you he was someone who'd come to hurt us. And you, my brave little girl, believed me. You kept the secret just like I asked. Emily paused, her voice breaking. But Catherine, here's what you didn't know. After I sent you back to the house, after you were safely in bed, I went back to the barn. And Thomas was conscious. He was alive. The world stopped spinning. Everything went silent. Even the sound of cars passing on the street below faded away. Alive. Uncle Thomas had been alive when I left the barn. All the nightmares, all the guilt, all the years of believing I'd witnessed death. And he'd been alive the entire time. What are you talking about? I heard myself say, my voice strange and distant. That man was dead. There was so much blood. He wasn't moving. He was dead. Emily looked up at me, her face pale. Your father says he wasn't. He says they talked for hours that night. He says Thomas apologized, said the years away had been hard, that gambling had destroyed his life. He'd hit rock bottom. Coming back wasn't about revenge anymore. It was desperation. I felt like I couldn't breathe. The attic was suddenly too small, too hot, the air too thick. Your father gave him a choice. Emily continued reading. Leave Victoria, start over somewhere else, and he'd forget that night ever happened. Or face the police and criminal charges. Thomas chose to leave. Your father gave him money to start fresh. Told him to change his name, build a new life, never contact the family again. And Thomas agreed. That night, as the storm cleared, he disappeared into the darkness. Your father never saw him again. Emily lowered the letter. Her green eyes met mine, full of questions and confusion and something that looked like disbelief. Your father let him go, she said. He helped him escape. And he made you keep a secret about something that never even happened the way you thought it did. I couldn't speak, couldn't move. For 53 years, I'd carried the weight of believing I'd witnessed murder. I'd had nightmares about that man's face, about the blood, about the terrible stillness of death. I'd shaped my entire life around keeping that secret, around protecting my father from consequences that should have been his to face. And it had all been a lie. Not the violence. That had been real. Not the blood. That had been real too. But the death, the murder, the terrible thing I thought I'd seen, none of that had actually happened. Grandma, Emily said softly, there's more. The letter keeps going. I don't think I can hear anymore, I whispered. But Emily was already reading again, and I was powerless to stop her. Catherine, I know this is overwhelming. I know you're probably angry, and you have every right to be. But there's something else you need to know. Thomas kept his word. He changed his name to Robert Mitchell and moved to Seattle. He got help for his gambling addiction, found work in construction, built a legitimate business. He married and had children. He became the man our father always hoped he could be. Children. Uncle Thomas had children. Which meant I had cousins, family I never knew existed. Over the years, Thomas sent your father letters. Not often, maybe once every few years. He never used his real name, but your father knew they were from him. He told him about his life, his family, his successes. He thanked your father for giving him a second chance. Emily's voice caught. And in his last letter, the one that arrived just a month before I wrote this, he told your father he was sick. Cancer. He had maybe months left to live. April 1972. 1 month before that terrible night in the barn. 4 months before my father died too. 2 brothers, both dying, both carrying secrets that should have been shared. He asked if he could come back, Emily continued. If he could see the farm one last time, see your father, maybe even meet you. He wanted to explain, to apologize, but your father said no. He was too afraid. Afraid of reopening old wounds, afraid of you finding out the truth. So he told Thomas to stay in Seattle, to die in peace, and to leave the family alone. I felt something crack inside my chest. My father had had a chance to make things right, to explain, to free me from the burden of that terrible secret. And he'd chosen fear instead. He'd chosen to let me keep carrying that weight. Now I'm dying too, Emily read, and I realize my fear has left you with a burden you never deserved. You've spent your whole life believing you witnessed death when you actually witnessed redemption. You've carried guilt for keeping a secret about something that wasn't what you thought it was. If you're reading this, Catherine, I hope you can forgive me. I hope you can understand that I was trying to protect you, even though I know now I only hurt you more. And I hope, somehow, you can find peace with the truth. Emily stopped reading. She carefully folded the pages and looked up at me with tears streaming down her face. Grandma, she said softly. He forgave himself. Your father forgave himself. And he wanted you to forgive yourself too. But I couldn't forgive, not yet. Because there was still something wrong with the story. Something that didn't make sense. If Thomas died of cancer in April 1972, I said slowly, then who was in the barn in May? Who did my father fight with? Who did I see lying in all that blood? Emily's face went even paler. She looked back down at the letter, flipping to the final page. "Oh no," she whispered. "Grandma, there's more. There's one more thing he needed to tell you." "Read it," I said, even though every instinct screamed at me to run, to leave that attic, to never hear the rest of the truth. But I'd come this far. And after 53 years of living in shadows, I needed to finally step into the light. No matter how much it burned. Emily's hands trembled as she lifted the final page. Her voice was barely a whisper now. "Catherine, the man in the barn that night wasn't Thomas. Thomas Williams, my brother, died on May 3rd, 1972. Just 11 days before that terrible storm. The cancer took him quickly in the end." The attic spun around me. If Thomas was already dead, then who had my father fought with? Who had I seen covered in blood on that barn floor? The man in the barn, Emily read, her voice shaking, was Thomas's son. "David Mitchell, your cousin, Catherine." A 21-year-old young man who came looking for answers about his father's past, about the family his father had left behind. He found old letters his dying father had kept, letters that mentioned Victoria and the Williams family. He came to our farm seeking connection, seeking to understand where he came from. My legs gave out. I slid down the doorframe until I was sitting on the dusty attic floor, my back against the wall. My cousin, not my uncle, seeking revenge, but my cousin seeking family. "And I," Emily continued reading, my father's words cutting through me like glass, "believing he was my brother, come back for revenge, I attacked him. I nearly killed an innocent young man who only wanted to know his family. I saw him going through boxes in the barn, and I didn't ask questions. I didn't give him a chance to explain. I just assumed the worst, and I attacked. The fight happened just as I told you. He fell and hit his head on the workbench. There was blood everywhere. But Catherine, when I brought you to the barn, when I showed you that young man lying there, I didn't know yet who he was. I thought he was Thomas. I thought I'd killed my own brother in a fight over property and pride and old wounds that should have healed decades ago. It wasn't until after I sent you back to the house that he regained consciousness. That's when he told me his name. David Mitchell. That's when he explained why he'd come. That's when I realized what I'd done. I'd attacked my own nephew, an innocent young man who'd just lost his father and was trying to find the family his father had left behind." Emily looked up at me, tears streaming down both our faces now. "Grandma," she whispered, "if David Mitchell survived that night, if he went back to Seattle, then he might still be alive. He'd be in his 70s now, and if he had children, they'd be your second cousins. And if they had children, they'd be my third cousins." She pulled out her phone with trembling hands. The color drained from her face as she stared at the screen. "Grandma," she said, her voice barely audible. "Jake Mitchell. My friend from school. His family just moved here from Seattle last year. His grandfather's name is David Mitchell. He moved to Victoria to be close to Jake's family. He's retired now, lives in Oak Bay." The room tilted. Jake Mitchell. The boy Emily studied with, the boy she'd mentioned dozens of times over the past year. The boy she'd laughed with, trusted, considered a friend. He was family. Real family. Connected to us through violence and secrets and 53 years of silence. "We have to talk to him," I heard myself say, my voice sounding strange and far away. "We have to tell him the truth. We have to give him the apology my father never could." But Emily was staring at her phone, her face growing paler by the second. "Grandma," she whispered, "Jake's grandfather David, he's still alive. He lives here in Victoria. We can talk to him directly. We can ask him what really happened that night. We can hear his side of the story." And just like that, the past wasn't past anymore. It was present. It was alive. It was waiting in Oak Bay for us to finally face it. If you've ever discovered a family secret that changed everything you thought you knew, leave a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from, because I need to know I'm not alone in this. That night, I didn't sleep. Not even for a minute. I lay in my bed, the same bed I'd slept in as a child, staring at the ceiling and watching shadows move across it as cars passed on Cook Street below. The letter sat on my nightstand, carefully placed back in its envelope. Next to it was my father's journal, which Emily and I had found at the bottom of that wooden box. I hadn't had the courage to open it yet. One devastating revelation per day was all my 95-year-old heart could handle. But my mind wouldn't stop racing. Every time I closed my eyes, I was 11 years old again, standing in that barn, rain drumming on the tin roof like bullets, watching a young man bleed on the floor. Except now, I knew the truth. Now, I understood that the man wasn't my Uncle Thomas seeking revenge. He was David Mitchell, barely more than a boy himself, trying to understand his own father's mysterious past. He had been innocent, seeking connection. And my father had attacked him out of fear and grief and confusion. The weight of that knowledge was crushing. For 53 years, I'd carried the burden of believing I'd witnessed something terrible. But the real terrible thing was different from what I'd imagined. It wasn't murder. It was a tragedy of misunderstanding. A young man looking for family and finding violence instead. An old wound that should have healed, creating a new one. And me, an 11-year-old child, trapped in the middle of it all. Used as a witness to anchor my father's fractured reality. At dawn, I finally gave up on sleep. I went downstairs to make coffee, my joints protesting every step. The house was quiet, filled with that peculiar silence that comes just before sunrise, when the world holds its breath between darkness and light. I stood at the kitchen window, watching the sky turn from black to deep blue to pale gold, and thought about all the mornings my father had stood in this same spot, carrying his own burden of guilt and secrets. How had he lived with it? How had he functioned day after day, knowing what he'd done? Knowing that somewhere in Seattle, a young man carried scars from an attack that never should have happened. Knowing that I carried the trauma of that night, believing I'd witnessed something even worse than the reality. The sound of a car door closing made me turn. Emily was already here, at 6 in the morning, carrying 2 takeout cups of coffee and a bag from our favorite bakery on 4th Street. She looked as tired as I felt, dark circles under her eyes betraying her own sleepless night. She let herself in with the key I'd given her years ago, and found me standing in the kitchen, still in my nightgown, staring out at the slowly brightening day. Couldn't sleep either, she asked quietly. I shook my head. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in that barn. We sat at the kitchen table, neither of us touching the coffee or the pastries. Just sitting together in shared shock, trying to process what we'd learned, trying to figure out what came next. I called Jake last night, Emily finally said. After I left your house, I told him we needed to talk to his grandfather about something important, something related to family history. He was confused, but he said his grandfather would be happy to meet us. They're expecting us at 10 this morning, 2 hours. I had 2 hours to prepare for a conversation 53 years in the making. 2 hours to figure out how to apologize for something my father did. How to explain the unexplainable, how to bridge a gap that had existed longer than Emily had been alive. We should bring the letters, I said, and the journal. He deserves to see everything. He deserves to know that my father documented what happened, that he carried the guilt until the day he died. Emily nodded. She'd already thought of that. She pulled a folder from her backpack containing carefully made copies of all the documents we'd found. I thought we should keep the originals safe, she explained. But David Mitchell should have copies of everything. It's his history too. His father's history. His family's history. My smart, thoughtful granddaughter. She'd inherited my curiosity, but she'd also kept something I'd lost along the way. A sense of justice, of making things right no matter how uncomfortable it might be. We spent the next hour going through the documents together, preparing ourselves for every question David Mitchell might ask. Emily read passages from my father's journal aloud, and I listened to thoughts he'd never shared with anyone while he was alive. June 1972, 1 month after the incident, my father had written, I can't stop thinking about that young man. David Mitchell, Thomas's son, my nephew. I keep wondering if he made it to the hospital in time, if the head injury caused permanent damage, if he recovered at all. I have no way of knowing. I can't call hospitals and ask without explaining what happened. I can't reach out to him because I don't even know where he's staying in Victoria. All I can do is pray that he's alive and healing and that someday, somehow, I'll have the chance to apologize. But that chance never came, I said softly. My father died 3 months after writing that entry. He never got to make amends. So we do it for him, Emily replied firmly. We give David Mitchell the apology your father never could. At 9:30, we got into Emily's car and drove toward Oak Bay, one of Victoria's most beautiful neighborhoods. Old money and new money mixed here. Houses had views of the ocean. Gardens bloomed year-round, despite the Canadian climate. It was the kind of place where successful people retired, where generations of families maintained summer homes, where the past and present existed side by side. Jake's grandfather lived in a modest bungalow on Beach Drive, close enough to the water that you could smell the salt air and hear the waves breaking on the rocky shore. As we pulled up to the house, I saw an elderly man sitting on the front porch in a wicker chair. He had a blanket over his lap, despite the mild October weather. He was reading a newspaper, and even from the car, I could see the resemblance to the young man I'd seen bleeding in our barn all those years ago. The same strong jawline, the same way of tilting his head when concentrating. But this man was old now, probably close to my own age, with white hair and the kind of stillness that comes from surviving life's hardest battles. Jake appeared at the front door, waving at us. Emily waved back, but I could see her hand shaking. This was harder than either of us had anticipated. One thing is discovering family secrets in the safety of your grandmother's attic. Another thing entirely is facing the living, breathing consequences of those secrets. We walked up the path together, and the elderly man looked up from his newspaper. His eyes, a striking blue that reminded me of the ocean on a clear day, studied us with curiosity. You must be Emily, he said, his voice warm and steady. Jake talks about you all the time. Top of his class in history, he says. And you're her grandmother, Catherine Williams, I said, extending my hand. It trembled slightly as he took it in his own. His grip was still strong despite his age. David Mitchell, he replied. Pleased to finally meet you both. Jake says you have some questions about family history. I'm always happy to talk about the past. At my age, the past is often clearer than the present. He smiled at his own joke, but I couldn't smile back. Instead, I felt tears burning in my eyes, threatening to spill over. The weight of what I needed to tell him was crushing my chest, making it hard to breathe. Mr. Mitchell, I began, my voice breaking. David, I need to tell you something. Something about a night in May 1972. Something that happened at my family's farm. The change in his expression was instantaneous. The warm smile faded. The easy friendliness in his eyes hardened into something else. Something watchful and wary. His hands, which had been relaxed in his lap, tightened into fists. The newspaper slipped from his fingers and fell to the porch floor. You know, he said quietly. After all these years, somehow, you know. Emily and I sat down in the wicker chairs across from him. Jake stood uncertainly by the door, confused but sensing this was something important. Something that went beyond a simple school project or casual family history discussion. Inside, I said, we should talk about this inside. What I need to tell you, what I need to show you, it's not a conversation for the porch where neighbors might hear. David nodded slowly and stood. His movements were careful. The movements of a man whose body had betrayed him more than once over the years. He led us into a living room that smelled of old books and fresh coffee. Photographs covered every available surface. I saw Jake in various stages of growing up. Saw who must be Jake's parents. And there, in a prominent position on the mantel, was a photograph of a young man in his 20s, standing in front of a construction site, smiling proudly at the camera. It was him. David Mitchell as he'd been before that terrible night. Before my father's fists. Before the blood and the fear and the years of silence. We all sat. The silence was heavy and expectant. I didn't know where to begin, how to bridge 53 years of silence with words. So instead, I reached into the folder Emily had brought and pulled out the copy of my father's letter. I handed it to David with shaking hands. Please, I said. Read this first. Then I'll explain everything. He took the letter carefully, his weathered hands trembling slightly, hands that were spotted with age and marked with scars from a lifetime of hard work and construction. He unfolded it slowly, almost reverently, and began to read. I watched his face as he processed my father's words. Saw emotions flicker across it like clouds racing across the sky. Shock, anger, confusion, sadness, and finally, something that looked like understanding. When he finished, he carefully refolded the letter and placed it on the coffee table between us. For a long moment, he said nothing. He just stared at the letter as if it were a living thing that might suddenly speak or disappear. Then, without looking up, he began to talk. May 14, 1972, he said, his voice distant, as if he were speaking from the past itself. I was 21 years old. My father had just died from cancer. It happened fast. Too fast. One day he was fine, the next he was in the hospital, and 6 weeks later he was gone. He looked up at me then, his blue eyes meeting mine. In those final days, he told me things, secret things he'd never shared before. About his life before Seattle. About a family he'd left behind in Victoria. About a brother named George Williams, your father. David's voice was steady now, but I could hear the emotion underneath it. The weight of decades of carrying his own secrets. He told me about the inheritance dispute. David continued. About the gambling that had destroyed his relationship with his family. About the night he left Victoria and changed his name. He made it sound like ancient history, like something that didn't matter anymore. But it mattered to me. I'd just lost my father, and suddenly I learned he'd had an entire life before me, a family I'd never met, a brother who might still be alive. So I came to Victoria to find him, David said. To find George Williams. To understand why my father had left. To see if maybe, just maybe, there was family here who might want to know me. I was young and grieving, and desperate for connection to the father I'd just lost. I found the farm easily enough. It wasn't hard. Small town, everyone knew the Williams family. But when I got there, it was late, after 10 at night. There was a storm coming in. I should have waited until morning. Should have knocked on the front door like a civilized person. But I was impatient. Emotional. Not thinking clearly. David's hands gripped the arms of his chair. I saw the barn and thought maybe I could find something there. Old documents, photographs, something that would give me insight into my father's past. So I went in. Started looking through boxes. I wasn't trying to steal anything. I was just trying to understand. That's when your father found me, David said, his voice hardening slightly. He came into the barn and saw me going through his things. And he thought I was my father. Thought Thomas had come back after all those years. I tried to explain who I was, tried to tell him I was Thomas's son, but he wasn't listening. He was so angry. So convinced I was there to steal from him or hurt him or get revenge for something that happened before I was even born. We argued. I kept trying to explain, but he wouldn't hear it. And then he attacked me. We fought, and I fell. Hit my head on something metal. The workbench, I learned later. There was so much blood. I remember thinking I was going to die there in that barn, killed by an uncle I'd never even known existed. The last thing I remember clearly, David said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, was looking up through the blood and pain and seeing a little girl in the doorway. She was wearing a nightgown. Her eyes were huge and terrified. She looked at me like I was a monster, like I was death itself. That was me, I whispered. I was 11. My father woke me up and brought me to the barn. I thought you were dead. For 53 years, I believed I had witnessed a death that night. David's expression softened immediately. The hardness in his eyes melted into something else. Something that looked like compassion. You thought I died? He asked gently. Oh, Catherine, no, I didn't die. Though it was close. When I came to, your father was gone. You were gone. I was alone in that barn, bleeding and confused and terrified. I managed to crawl to my car. Don't know how, adrenaline, I suppose. Drove myself to the hospital here in Victoria. Told them I'd been in an accident. They kept me for 3 days with a severe concussion and stitches in my scalp. He reached up and moved his white hair aside, showing me a long scar that ran along his temple. This was your father's handiwork. Then what happened? Emily asked softly. Why didn't you go to the police? Why didn't you press charges? David was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was filled with a sadness that seemed to come from somewhere deep and ancient. Because I understood, he said simply. I understood why your grandfather did what he did. I'd broken into his barn in the middle of the night. I was going through his things. I looked exactly like my father, who he believed had sworn revenge on him years earlier. From his perspective, he was defending his property and his family, and I was a young man who'd just lost his father and wasn't thinking clearly about how my actions would be perceived. Plus, David continued, I'd read my father's letters. I knew about the gambling, the debts, the people he'd hurt with his addiction. I knew my father wasn't innocent in what happened between him and his brother. So I decided to just leave. Go back to Seattle. Try to forget the whole thing. Build my own life without the shadow of my father's mistakes hanging over me. But you couldn't forget, I said. Could you? David shook his head slowly. No, I couldn't forget. For years, I tried to understand what happened that night. Why my uncle attacked me. Why he was so angry. Why my father had really left Victoria. It wasn't until much later, after my mother died and I was going through her things, that I found more letters. Letters she'd kept from my father. Letters that told the whole story. The inheritance, the violence, the exile, everything. I reached into the folder again and pulled out my father's journal. He documented everything, I said, handing it to David. Every letter your father sent him over the years. Every moment of guilt he felt about that night in the barn. Every prayer that you had survived. He wanted to apologize, David. He tried to find you, but he didn't know your name, didn't know how to reach you without risking exposure of what happened. And then he got sick, and he ran out of time. David took the journal with something like reverence. He opened it carefully, flipping through pages filled with my father's neat handwriting. As he read, tears started running down his weathered face, dropping onto the pages and smudging the ink slightly. He wanted to apologize, David repeated quietly, as if he couldn't quite believe it. All these years, I thought he didn't care. Thought he'd simply attacked me and moved on with his life without a second thought. Thought I was just collateral damage in an old family war that had nothing to do with me. He cared, I said firmly, my own tears flowing freely now. He carried the guilt until the day he died, and he left that letter for me, hoping that someday I'd find it, read it, and somehow make things right. I'm 53 years too late, but I'm here now, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for what my father did to you. For the pain he caused. For the scars you've carried all these years. David looked up from the journal, his blue eyes meeting mine through our shared tears. And I'm sorry too, he said. I'm sorry I broke into your barn that night. I'm sorry my search for family brought violence into your childhood. I'm sorry you've carried the weight of thinking you witnessed a death for all these years. We've both been carrying burdens that were too heavy. Maybe it's time we finally put them down. Jake, who had been standing silently by the window this entire time, finally spoke. Grandpa, he said, his voice shaky. Are you saying that Mrs. Williams is our family? That her father was your uncle? David nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. Yes, Jake. Catherine Williams is my first cousin, which makes her your second cousin once removed. And Emily, you're Jake's third cousin. We're all family. We've always been family. We just didn't know it. The revelation transformed the space between us. We weren't strangers anymore. We were family, connected by blood and history and secrets that had finally been brought to light after 53 years of darkness. If you've ever had to deliver a difficult truth to someone, if you've ever had to apologize for something that happened decades ago, leave a comment. Tell me your story. Because healing doesn't have a timeline. Over the following weeks, David Mitchell and I spent hours together, piecing together our family history like archaeologists, carefully brushing away decades of dust and dirt to reveal the bones of truth underneath. We met almost every day, sometimes at his house in Oak Bay, sometimes at my place on Cook Street, always with coffee and old photographs spread across whatever table was available. He showed me pictures of his father, Thomas Williams, as he'd been in Seattle. Not the angry, desperate gambler my father had described, but a transformed man. A smiling man with kind eyes, surrounded by children and grandchildren who clearly adored him. Pictures of his construction company, Mitchell Building Services, which he'd built from nothing. Pictures of family barbecues and birthday parties and Christmases. Evidence of a life well lived. A life that proved redemption was possible, even after terrible mistakes. In return, I showed David the farm where it had all begun. Emily drove us out to the subdivision that now covered the land where I'd grown up. The farmhouse was gone. The barn was gone. In their place stood rows of modern homes with manicured lawns and two-car garages. But I could still see it all in my mind, could still point out where everything had been. The farmhouse was right there, I told David, pointing to a house with blue shutters. The barn was over there, where those homes with the brick facades are now. The apple orchard was behind us. The chicken coop was to the left, and those fields, where those people have their perfect green lawns, that's where I used to play as a child. That's where your father and my father played together when they were boys. David stood looking at the modern landscape overlaying the past, trying to reconcile the two. This is where my father grew up, he said wonderingly. This is where he learned to work the land. Where he fought with his brother over inheritance and pride. Where he made the choices that led him to Seattle, and to my mother, and ultimately to me. If none of this had happened, if the inheritance hadn't been disputed, if the violence hadn't occurred, I wouldn't exist. My children wouldn't exist. Jake wouldn't exist. It's strange how that works, I agreed. How terrible things can lead to beautiful outcomes. How pain can lead to growth. How secrets, when finally revealed, can lead to healing instead of more harm. One afternoon, about 3 weeks after that first meeting, David and I sat in my kitchen, drinking tea and looking through my father's journal together. We'd been reading it slowly, carefully, discussing each entry. This particular day, we came across something that made both of us stop breathing. July 1972, my father had written, 2 months after the incident. I received a letter today with a Seattle postmark. No return address. Inside was a single sentence, written in handwriting I didn't recognize but somehow knew immediately. I survived. I forgive you. Please forgive yourself. I knew it was from David. From my nephew. The young man I'd attacked in the barn. He'd survived. He'd recovered. And somehow, impossibly, he'd forgiven me. That letter should have brought me peace. Should have freed me from the guilt. But instead, it made everything worse. Because now I knew I'd hurt an innocent person, someone who came seeking family and found violence instead. Someone who still had the grace to offer forgiveness to someone who didn't deserve it. David's hands were shaking as he held the journal. You sent that letter, I said softly. You forgave him even though you had every right to hate him. He nodded, tears streaming down his face. I was 21 years old and I'd just realized something important. Hate is a poison you drink, hoping the other person dies. I didn't want to spend my life poisoned by anger toward a man who made a terrible mistake out of fear and grief. So I sent that letter, hoping it would help him find peace. But it didn't, I said, looking at the journal entry. It made him feel worse, made him realize the full weight of what he'd done. David was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that changed everything. Maybe that's what real forgiveness is, Catherine. Not erasing the consequences of our actions, but facing them, living with them, growing from them. Your father spent the rest of his life trying to be a better man because of what he did that night. My letter didn't erase his guilt, but maybe it helped him transform it into something useful, into wisdom, into compassion. Into the father who raised you and loved you and ultimately left you the truth, so you could finally be free. We decided, David and I, to organize a family gathering. A proper one, where all the scattered branches of the Williams and Mitchell families could come together. Where people who didn't know they were related could finally meet. Where secrets could be replaced with truth and isolation could be replaced with connection. We chose Thanksgiving, that uniquely North American holiday about gratitude and family, as the perfect time. The gathering was held at David's house, which was bigger than mine and could accommodate everyone. His children came. Jake's parents, Susan and David Jr., along with Jake's sister Emma, flew in from Seattle. My children came to Emily's father Mark and her aunt Jennifer, both of them shocked to learn they had cousins they'd never known about. There were grandchildren and great-grandchildren, nieces and nephews. A whole crowd of people connected by blood and history, who'd lived their entire lives not knowing the others existed. Before dinner, David and I stood up together in his living room. We'd prepared something, a joint statement explaining everything. The room fell silent as we began to speak, taking turns telling the story from beginning to end. We told them about Thomas and George Williams, two brothers who grew up on a farm in Victoria, about an inheritance dispute that tore them apart, about Thomas's gambling addiction and exile to Seattle, about his transformation into Robert Mitchell, a successful businessman and devoted father, about his death from cancer in April 1972, just weeks before the incident that would connect our families in ways none of us could have imagined. We told them about that stormy night in May, when David, young and grieving, came to Victoria seeking family, and found violence instead. About the fight in the barn. About my father's terrible mistake of attacking his own nephew. About me, an 11-year-old girl, being used as a witness to something I was too young to understand. We told them about 53 years of silence. About guilt, and nightmares and secrets buried so deep we thought they'd never resurface. About a letter hidden in an attic, waiting for the right moment to finally reveal the truth. About Emily's courage in opening that letter and insisting we face what it contained. There were tears as we spoke, questions, moments of anger and confusion. Some people couldn't believe their family history had been hidden from them for so long. Others couldn't believe the violence that had occurred. But there was also understanding, acceptance, and ultimately, forgiveness. Because that's what families do, I said, as David and I finished our story. They make mistakes, they hurt each other, they keep secrets, but they also come together. They heal, they forgive, and they build something new from the broken pieces of what came before. As we sat down to dinner, I looked around the table at all these faces. This family I didn't know I had. My second cousins and third cousins and their children. People who shared my blood but whom I'd lived 95 years without meeting. I thought about my father and his brother Thomas, about the choices they made and the consequences that rippled through generations like stones thrown into still water. I thought about that 11-year-old girl standing in a barn, believing she'd witnessed death, not knowing she'd actually witnessed the beginning of something. A secret that would eventually bring divided families back together. A wound that would eventually heal stronger than the original flesh. Emily sat next to Jake, the two of them talking and laughing. They'd become even closer since learning they were cousins. They had that easy comfort with each other that comes from shared history, even history they'd only recently learned about. Watching them, I felt something I hadn't felt in 53 years. I felt free. After dinner, David pulled me aside into his study. He handed me a small box, wrapped carefully in brown paper. "For you," he said. "Something I think you should have." I opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a photograph I'd never seen before. Two young boys, maybe 7 and 9 years old, standing in front of a barn. The same barn where everything had happened. They had their arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera. The bond between them was evident even across the decades. Brothers who loved each other before life got complicated, before inheritance and anger and violence, before everything fell apart. "My father and Thomas," I whispered, holding the photograph like it was made of glass. "Before everything went wrong, when they were just brothers who loved each other, I thought you should remember them this way. David said gently. Not as men who made terrible mistakes, but as boys who loved each other before life got complicated. Because that's who they really were, underneath everything else. Brothers, family. I hugged him then. This cousin I'd only known for a few weeks, but who already felt like family in the deepest sense of the word. Thank you, I said. For forgiving us. For letting us be family again. For giving me the gift of knowing you. We never stopped being family, David replied, holding me tight. We just lost sight of it for a while. But now we've found our way back, and that's all that matters. As the evening wound down and people started heading home, Emily found me in David's kitchen, washing dishes. She wrapped her arms around me from behind, resting her head on my shoulder. Grandma, she said softly, I'm glad I found that box. I know it was painful at first, but look what it led to. Look at what we have now. Look at all these people who are connected to us, who we never would have known if I hadn't opened that letter. I turned to face her, this brave, curious girl who had inadvertently healed wounds she didn't even know existed. You're right, I said, pulling her close. Sometimes the things we're most afraid of, the truths we've buried deepest, those are exactly the things that need to come to light. Because secrets don't protect us, sweetheart, they imprison us. And truth, no matter how painful, is what sets us free. That night, when I finally got home to my house on Cook Street, I climbed the stairs to the attic one more time. My legs protested every step, but I needed to do this. Needed to complete the circle. The wooden box was still there where Emily had left it, but it was empty now. The letters had been distributed to family members who wanted copies. The journal had been given to David. The photograph of the two brothers as boys sat on my nightstand downstairs, in a silver frame David had insisted I take. The secrets had been shared, acknowledged, processed. The truth had been told. The wounds had begun to heal. I picked up the empty box and carried it downstairs. In the backyard, under the stars, I built a small fire in the metal fire pit my late husband had installed decades ago. One of the few things I'd kept of his after he passed. I placed the box in the flames and watched it burn. The wood crackled and popped, sending sparks up into the clear October night sky. As the box turned to ash, I felt the last of the weight lifting from my shoulders. 53 years of carrying a secret that wasn't mine to carry. 53 years of believing I'd witnessed something I hadn't. 53 years of living in the shadow of that May night in 1972. But now, finally, I was free. The secret was gone. The truth was known. And our family, fractured for generations, was finally, slowly, beginning to heal. Before you close this video, let me ask you something. Have you ever kept a secret that weighed on you for years? Have you ever discovered something about your family that changed how you saw everything? Leave a comment and tell me. Because I've learned that we're all carrying something. And sometimes, sharing our burdens is the first step toward healing. 3 months after that first Thanksgiving gathering, David Mitchell called me early one morning. It was January, cold and gray. The kind of Victoria winter day where the rain never quite decides whether to fall, or just hang in the air like mist. His voice on the phone sounded different. Strained, tired. Catherine, he said. I need to tell you something. Can you come over today? My heart seized immediately. That tone, I'd heard it before. From doctors delivering bad news. From lawyers reading wills. From people who had to say things they didn't want to say. I'll be there in an hour, I told him. Emily drove me to Oak Bay through the gray morning. Neither of us spoke much. We both knew something had changed. Something was wrong. When we arrived at David's house, Jake met us at the door. His eyes were red, and I knew immediately what David needed to tell me. The cancer, I said. It's back. Jake nodded, unable to speak. He led us inside where David sat in his favorite chair, wrapped in blankets despite the heater running full blast. He looked older than he had 3 months ago. Frailer, the disease was already taking its toll. Pancreatic cancer, David said without preamble when I sat down across from him. The doctors say I have maybe 6 months, maybe less. They want to try treatment, but at my age, With how aggressive it is, I'm not sure I want to spend my last month sick from chemotherapy. I reached across and took his hand. It was cold, despite the blankets, despite the heat in the room. I'm sorry, I said. After everything, after finally finding each other, this isn't fair. David smiled, and despite the circumstances, it was a real smile, warm and genuine. Catherine, he said, I'm 74 years old. I've lived a good life, built a successful business, raised wonderful children, have grandchildren I adore. And in the last 3 months, I've gained an entire branch of family I never knew existed. I've healed a wound that was 53 years old. I've forgiven and been forgiven. If I die tomorrow, I'll die complete. That's more than most people get. But there is something I need to ask you, he continued. Something important. Will you help me tell the whole story? Not just our story, but my father's story too. Thomas Williams deserves to have his redemption known. He made terrible mistakes, yes, but he spent the rest of his life making amends, building something good, becoming the father I needed him to be. I want people to know that it's possible to change, that it's never too late to become a better person. Over the next few months, David and I worked together to document everything. We recorded hours of conversations about his father, Thomas, about the gambling addiction and the recovery, about the business Thomas built in Seattle, about the man he became after leaving Victoria. We gathered photographs and letters and documents. We interviewed David's siblings, who had their own memories and stories to share. Emily helped us create a family archive, digitizing everything so it would be preserved for future generations. Jake worked with a local historical society to document the Williams family farm and its place in Victoria's history. My children, Mark and Jennifer, contributed their own memories of their grandfather. My father, filling in pieces of his character that I'd never fully appreciated. What emerged was a complete picture of two brothers whose lives had taken such different paths. George Williams, who stayed in Victoria, inherited the farm, raised a family, carried guilt and secrets until his death. And Thomas Williams, who left in disgrace, changed his name, fought his demons, and ultimately built a life of meaning and purpose in Seattle. Neither man was perfect. Both made terrible mistakes. But both, in their own ways, tried to be better than their worst moments. David's health declined rapidly. By April, he was confined to his bed, too weak to do much more than receive visitors and sleep. But his mind remained sharp until the very end. He wanted to talk about the family, about the stories we'd collected, about the legacy he was leaving behind. One afternoon, about a week before he died, I sat by his bedside, reading him excerpts from the family history we'd compiled. He listened with his eyes closed, a small smile on his face. When I finished, he opened his eyes and looked at me. Catherine, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Thank you. Thank you for finding me. Thank you for telling me the truth. Thank you for giving me these last months with family I didn't know I had. These have been the best months of my life. The tears came then, streaming down my face unchecked. You don't have to thank me, I said. You're the one who forgave. You're the one who had the grace to let go of anger and embrace family, despite everything that happened. I should be thanking you. We both did what needed to be done, David said. We both chose healing over bitterness, and that's made all the difference. David Mitchell died on April 27th, surrounded by his children and grandchildren. Emily and I were there too, along with Mark and Jennifer. We'd become part of the family in those final months, woven into the fabric of their lives in a way that felt both new and ancient at the same time. The funeral was held at a church in Oak Bay. Hundreds of people came. Business associates, friends, neighbors, and family. Both the family who'd known David his whole life, and the family who'd only known him for 6 months but loved him just as deeply. Jake asked me to speak at the service. I was 95 years old, speaking at the funeral of a cousin I'd only known briefly but who had changed my life in profound ways. I stood at the podium, looking out at all those faces, and I told them David's story. Not just the story of his success in business or his devotion to his family, But the story of that night in May 1972. The story of a young man seeking connection and finding violence. The story of forgiveness offered when it wasn't deserved. The story of two families divided by secrets and reunited by truth. David Mitchell taught me something important, I said to the crowd. He taught me that forgiveness isn't about forgetting what happened or pretending it didn't hurt. It's about choosing to move forward anyway. It's about refusing to let the worst moments of our lives define us. It's about building something good from the broken pieces of what came before. My father made a terrible mistake 53 years ago. He attacked an innocent young man out of fear and confusion. That mistake could have destroyed both our families. Could have created a legacy of hatred and bitterness that passed down through generations. But David chose differently. He chose forgiveness. He chose grace. And because of that choice, both our families are richer, more connected, more whole. If you take anything from David's life, let it be this. It's never too late to tell the truth. It's never too late to seek forgiveness. It's never too late to heal old wounds. And it's never too late to choose love over hate, connection over isolation, family over division. After the funeral, Emily and I drove back to my house on Cook Street. We sat in the kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd baked pies and drunk coffee, and avoided the truth for 53 years. The same kitchen where Emily had returned from the attic that October day with a letter that changed everything. "Grandma," Emily said, holding my hand across the table. "Are you okay?" I thought about the question. Was I okay? I'd lost a cousin I'd barely known. I was 95 years old, facing my own mortality. I'd spent the last 6 months reliving the most traumatic night of my childhood. But I'd also gained so much. A family I didn't know existed. Truth after decades of secrets. Freedom from a burden I'd carried for more than half my life. "Yes," I said finally. "I'm okay. More than okay. For the first time in 53 years, I'm at peace." That night, I pulled out the photograph David had given me. The one of my father and Uncle Thomas as boys, arms around each other, grinning at the camera. I placed it on my nightstand next to a new photograph. This one was from Thanksgiving, taken just a few months ago. It showed me and David sitting together, surrounded by our combined families. 3 generations of Williamses and Mitchells, together at last. 2 brothers who loved each other. 2 families divided. 2 cousins who found each other. And 2 photographs that told the whole story. Before and after. Pain and healing. Division and reunion. I lay in bed that night, looking at those photographs, and I thought about everything that had happened since that October day when Emily found the box in my attic. All the tears and revelations and difficult conversations. All the joy of discovering family. All the pain of facing hard truths. All the grace of forgiveness offered and received. Was it worth it? Was it worth opening that box, reading that letter, facing those secrets? Yes, 1,000 times yes. Because the truth, no matter how painful, is always better than living a lie. Because family, even family you discover late in life, is always worth fighting for. Because forgiveness, both given and received, is the only path to real freedom. And because secrets, no matter how deeply buried, will always find a way to surface. The only question is whether they'll surface in time for healing or too late for anything but regret. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of 95 years settle over me like a familiar blanket, but it wasn't a heavy weight anymore. It was just life, full and complex and messy and beautiful, full of mistakes and redemption, full of loss and discovery, full of pain and joy and everything in between. And I was grateful for all of it. Even the hard parts. Especially the hard parts. Because the hard parts were what taught me that it's never too late. Never too late to tell the truth. Never too late to seek healing. Never too late to find family. Never too late to forgive. My name is Catherine Williams. I'm 95 years old. I live in the same house where I grew up in Victoria, British Columbia. For 53 years, I carried a secret that wasn't what I thought it was. I believed I'd witnessed death when I'd actually witnessed the beginning of redemption. I believed I was protecting my father when I was actually imprisoning both of us. I believed silence was safety when it was actually a cage. But now I'm free. The box is ashes. The secrets are out. The truth has been told. And my family, broken for generations, is finally healing. If you've made it this far, if you've listened to my entire story, I want to ask you something. What secrets are you carrying? What truths have you buried? What conversations are you avoiding because they're too hard or too painful or too scary? Don't wait 53 years like I did. Don't let fear keep you from freedom. Don't let pride keep you from family. Don't let shame keep you from truth. Tell the hard truths. Have the difficult conversations. Open the boxes you've kept locked. Face the things you've been running from. Because I promise you, no matter how scary it seems, the truth will set you free. And family, even family that's been lost for generations, is worth fighting to find. Life is too short to carry burdens that don't belong to you. Life is too precious to let fear keep you from connection. And family, despite all its complications and pain and messy history, is too important to let secrets tear it apart. So if this story moved you, if it made you think about your own family secrets, your own buried truths, your own need for forgiveness or healing, then do something about it. Make that phone call, write that letter, have that conversation, open that box, do it today, do it now. Because tomorrow isn't promised, and the longer you wait, the harder it gets. Trust me, I waited 53 years, and while I'm grateful for the healing that finally came, I'll always wonder what those 53 years could have been like if I'd had the courage to face the truth sooner. Don't make my mistake. Don't let fear steal decades of your life. Choose truth. Choose healing. Choose family. Choose freedom. And if you do, if you find the courage to face your own secrets and tell your own hard truths, leave a comment and tell me about it. Because we're all in this together, trying to find our way back to ourselves, back to each other, back to what really matters. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for being part of this journey. And remember, it's never too late. Never too late to tell the truth. Never too late to seek forgiveness. Never too late to find your way back home. If this story touched your heart, hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what family story you're carrying. Because every story matters. Every truth deserves to be told. And every family, no matter how broken, deserves a chance to heal. My box is empty now. My secrets are out. My family is whole. What about yours?